On April 29, 2003, the Brigham Young University College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences announced the establishment of an endowed chair in the name of Marjorie Pay Hinckley. The chair is a fitting tribute to an extraordinary lady and her lifelong commitment to the development of the whole woman and the strengthening of parents and children. Wife of Gordon B. Hinckley, 15th President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Marjorie Hinckley frequently accompanies her husband on trips of goodwill across the globe. Over the years, she has left a powerful impression of virtue and kindness with millions of people who affectionately refer to this loving matriarch simply as Sister Hinckley.
I try to make people feel comfortable with what they are and who they are, and let them know that they're appreciated, that they're making a contribution. They are. People generally are good. In the church or out of the church, people are good.
It was in the spring of 1937, as America struggled in the grip of the Great Depression, that Marjorie Pay married Gordon B. Hinckley in the Salt Lake Temple. But in spite of economic challenges, Sister Hinckley faced life with the bright outlook that would eventually become one of her trademarks.
Just before the wedding, Dad confessed to Mother that his total net worth consisted of a $150 savings account, and that perhaps they should postpone their marriage until he could accumulate enough to support her. In her typical cheerful way, she exclaimed, "All I was expecting was a husband. And now I had $150 as well." I was thrilled.
When I look back upon our early years, I tremble to think of the little money that we had to live on. I earned a very small salary, but that was the bottom of the Depression. A few dollars bought a substantial supply of groceries, and we made it all right. We built a pleasant home in East Mill Creek and settled down and reared our family there. 3 daughters, 2 sons. It was a very lively household, and the mother of those children was the very center of it. She was a tremendous worker, a hard worker. She was always planting flowers, doing this, doing that, beautifying the home, serving in the church in a variety of capacities, and rearing her children. She's been the lodestar of their lives, and they all look back to her as the source of inspiration and one to have a happy time with. They love her, she loves them.
A central figure in her own family, Sister Hinckley has also become a champion for the family both here and abroad. As she travels the world over, the counsel she gives centers on building stronger, happier homes.
Mothering really is hard.
Even at this age.
But it doesn't mean you can't love it. And so I would say to all of you, have joy in your mothering. Especially wonderful were the summers when the children were young and home where I could be the boss. I did my best to keep those summers unstructured so they'd have time to explore and lie on their backs and listen to the birds.
Mother, over the years, your advice and influence has shaped my life. What message would you like to share with these women today?
I don't know. Don't worry, I've got it written here. My advice is to be the best person you can be. Profound, isn't it?
Although her impact on those around her has been profound, it is Sister Hinckley's sense of humor that many recognize as her most endearing trait, one that is manifest consistently in her relationship with her husband.
We learned long ago that you can't take life too seriously. You just have to laugh your way through.
I love this dear companion of mine. We've been at it a long time, and to her I give all the credit for the virtues of our family, including our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. She holds a very bright spot in their hearts, as do I, and my love for her extends over a very long period of time, and I expect it will go on forever.
The quiet conviction shared by President and Sister Hinckley is held throughout the Church that a loving bond uniting husband, wife, and children is one of the basic cornerstones of a strong society and a stable world. Yet statistics showing the disintegration of the family are alarmingly common across the globe. Divorce, neglect, abuse, abortion, addiction. Sorrow and despair, it would seem, are running rampant worldwide. But to the ever-optimistic Marjorie Hinckley, these problems present opportunities to make a difference, with answers rooted in love, compassion, and a desire to uplift others.
Tonight, the Marjorie Hinckley Lecture will be delivered by Dr. Kristin Anderson Moore, Senior Scholar and Area Program Director for Child Trends. She'll be introduced by Professor Rick Miller, Director of the School of Family Life. Rick?
Dr. Kristin Anderson Moore is one of the most influential voices in the country on children's issues. She has worked at Child Trends in Washington, D.C. since 1982, where she served as president of the organization for 9 years. With a reputation as one of the nation's leading sources of credible data and high-quality research on children, policymakers in Washington, D.C., including the staffs and members of the Congress, regularly seek data and analysis provided by Child Trends to inform their decision-making. Dr. Moore is a world-class researcher. Since the year 2000, she has published over 45 scholarly articles and book chapters. She is a highly respected methodologist, and she has been a leader in developing several large surveys, such as the National Survey of Children, the National Survey of Children's Health, and the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. An important part of her work at Child Trends is the development of research briefs that provide, in a concise format, important research finding on specific topics to inform policymakers. For example, some of the research briefs that she has recently authored include How Welfare Reform Might Affect Children, Children in Poverty, Building a Better Teenager, and What is a Healthy Marriage? She has delivered congressional testimony on numerous occasions and has briefed senior federal officials in both the current and past administrations on child and family issues. Most importantly, Dr. Moore is a wonderful person. Despite her high stature among researchers and policymakers on a national level, she remains incredibly accessible and generous to others. She readily collaborates with other researchers, including some scholars at Brigham Young University. She's also hosted undergraduate BYU students and mentored research experiences at Child Trends. Dr. Moore has been married to her husband, Jeff, for 36 years, and she has 3 children. We are honored to have Dr. Moore present the Marjorie Hinckley Lecture tonight.
Good evening. I'm delighted and honored to be here. I was able to see this video about Marjorie Hinckley some weeks ago, and her warmth and positive approach to life come across very clearly. So I think that she might enjoy this conversation because I wanted to explore taking a new and more positive look at child and family well-being, a look that is optimistic, yet practical and grounded in reality. The reality is that major improvements in well-being have occurred over the decades, and if you look across a period of a century, they really add up. For example, infant mortality rates have dropped enormously since the early 1900s. While disparities remain and are troubling, it is important to note that really substantial improvements have occurred for both whites and non-whites. In addition, average life expectancies increased by several decades over the last century for both women, shown in red, and for men. For example, women's life expectancy, on average, has risen from about 50 to about 80. And levels of education have risen substantially. Moreover, as this chart shows, disparities in education between whites and other groups, while still present, have declined. In addition, there have been substantial increases in average household income. Here, income is shown in 2003 dollars, and you can see that even adjusted for inflation, household incomes have risen a lot compared with the early years of the 20th century. While other examples could be shared, these major improvements in critical aspects of well-being, infant mortality, life expectancy, education, and average household income, illustrate the gains made in the social and economic well-being in this country. Yet, the public is concerned, skeptical, and sometimes quite negative about America's children and families. For example, polls by Child Trends conducted with the support of the Annie E. Casey Foundation indicate that the public consistently overestimates problems. One of the questions we asked was, what % of children have no health insurance? Is it 10%, 20%, or 30%? The correct answer is about 10%, but 2/3 of the respondents said 30%, and nearly all of the rest said 20%. In other words, the public overestimated the magnitude of the problem by a factor of 2 or 3. And we found the same pattern with a number of similar questions. Moreover, the public was unaware of positive trends, such as the decline in the teen birth rate. Others have found similar patterns. So we asked ourselves, why is this? Why is the public so negative? One place to look is what the public hears about kids. These indicators of child well-being reflect the current stock of indicators available to be included in America's Children, Key National Indicators of Child Well-Being, which is the official publication of the federal statistical agencies about children. Pretty negative. And the message about families is similarly negative. Well, it seems it's time for a new look. In this talk, I want to address 4 questions. First, why is there an unbalanced focus on the negative? And second, why should child and family strengths get more attention? Third, what do we mean by child and family strengths? And fourth, what steps might be taken? First, why is there such an unbalanced focus on the negative when it comes to children and families? There are, I think, multiple reasons. Given that I have lived my entire professional life in Washington, D.C., one obvious explanation to me is that problems are what government agencies are charged to address. From adolescent pregnancy to juvenile delinquency to mental illness and child abuse, there is a government agency to address each problem. I don't want to be critical of these agencies because they are addressing important problems. I merely note the imbalance. The reason that the official government report on children contains such a preponderance of negative indicators is that's what the various agencies collect. Government agencies address problems. Second, there is greater agreement in the nation on what is bad or harmful. We all agree that losing a child to illness or accident is a tragedy, and that crime and violence are bad. We are not in similar agreement, though, about what is good. For example, is religiosity or spirituality a good thing for children? Well, there's certainly a lot of research suggesting that more religious children and families flourish. But there simply isn't a national consensus about religiosity, the same way that there is for crime, violence, and mortality. Well, third, the media and the public focus on the negative. I can illustrate with the story of 2 Child Trends research briefs released within weeks of one another. One was on positive relationships between adolescents and their parents. The other was on where and when teenagers first have sex. Guess which one got more coverage? They're both important topics, but the stories covering where and when teens first have sex were in newspapers, talk shows, college newspapers, radio, everywhere. But we only got a couple of stories sharing the important positive stories that most adolescents actually like their parents and want to spend time with them. I also hear a lot of skepticism about the importance of family processes. Take gratitude. A small number of intriguing studies have found that interventions to increase gratitude can make people happier and even reduce depression. What would it take to make gratitude go large scale? Well, a recent issue of The Economist focused on economic research on happiness. And here's a letter that came to the editor after that. You should not become embroiled in debating what constitutes happiness and how it can be measured. The aim of economists is to find the best ways to engender wealth. Well, since the evidence does not suggest that wealth creates happiness, I think it's important to explore positive processes. But I recognize that skepticism. Also, there's more of a focus on well-becoming than on well-being. Well-being refers to outcomes in the future, like getting a good job, making a good living, paying taxes, while well-being refers to happiness, joy, satisfaction, and purpose in the present. It is interesting that the word well-being is often used when people really mean well-becoming. And of course, we want children to grow up to be good citizens, workers, and taxpayers. However, because of this intense focus, well-being while children are children has gotten far less attention. Obviously, war and terrorism contribute to a negative worldview in the world as well. And finally, I want to acknowledge that bad outcomes do matter. In fact, they matter a lot. Indeed, there is some evidence that bad is stronger than good. For example, conflict and violence and abuse are extremely negative experiences for children and for adults as well. Some research suggests that you need 3 to 5 times as many positive experiences as negative experiences. For example, to outweigh an argument, a bunch of flowers may not be sufficient. It may take an apology, a fun evening out, a good conversation, a heartfelt compliment, and a bunch of flowers. I emphasize this because I want to be very clear that I think bad outcomes matter. I'm not suggesting that we replace work on bad outcomes with a Pollyannish focus on positive outcomes, but rather that we focus on both, because it is critical to note that good outcomes matter too. For example, positive social and emotional development, good health, safety, and a joy in learning are also critical. Well, question 2, why should child and family strengths positive outcomes get more attention? Again, I see multiple and important reasons. One reason is that it's good science to address positive outcomes as well as negative outcomes. Merely addressing problems fails to recognize the breadth of human development, both in terms of the contexts that foster positive development and in terms of the characteristics that constitute good development. In addition, experimental studies have found that didactic approaches increase knowledge, but they don't affect behavior. For example, didactic sex education as well as didactic drug education increase knowledge, but they don't change behavior. Moreover, negative approaches like Scared Straight, where teenagers are brought into prisons to meet with hardened criminals in the hope that the experience will scare them into going straight, have actually been found to have negative outcomes. These unpromising results for didactic and negative approaches contrast with the positive outcomes found for more positive approaches, such as after-school youth development programs, mentoring, and high-quality preschool programs. Moreover, there is an evolving research base that indicates that positive relationships and involvement in positive activities lead to better health and educational outcomes for children. For example, in our analyses of the NLSY, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the 1997 cohort, we find that adolescents who report they have a positive relationship with their mother, shown in red, are just 70% as likely to become sexually active, net of controls, as adolescents who do not have a positive relationship with their mother. Similarly, adolescents who have a positive relationship with their mother, again in red, are just 57% as likely to be behind in school, net of other factors. Well, good science also requires good measurement, and here too, fears seem unwarranted. I often hear criticism of positive measures, like relationships and social skills, that they are soft or squishy or gluey. However, positive constructs can be rigorously and scientifically measured. For example, missing data tends to be quite minimal. Actually, the hardest thing to measure is income. In analyses of the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, we found that less than 1% of the respondents did not answer questions on parent-child relationships. This is much lower than the 13.5% who refused to answer questions on income. And as we just saw, parent-child relationships predict child outcomes over and above the effect of income. So I think positive approaches meet the criteria for good science. Well, second, as I noted, a number of studies find that the public's perceptions about children, and particularly adolescents, are extremely negative. Obviously, this reflects many forces, but I suspect that these negative perceptions have important implications for people's behavior. Why would you become a volunteer mentor if you think that all teens, especially disadvantaged teens, are rude and dangerous? Why put dollars into after-school programs if you think children are problem-prone and generally hopeless? Try this little thought experiment. How do you think most Americans would answer these questions? Teenagers think parents are dumb, behind the times, too busy. The public sees teenagers as, there's research on this, rude and lazy and subject to peer pressure. American families are falling apart, materialistic, disintegrating. Negative stereotypes about children and families, studies find, are quite widespread. Not to say that everything's perfect. I nevertheless suggest that we need to have a vision of not just what we want to squelch, but a vision of what we want for children and families. And we need a more accurate picture of the many children and adolescents who are flourishing, not just those who are in trouble. This might contribute to a more balanced public perception of children and adolescents, and this might lead the public to feel that public and private investments in children are more worthwhile. Well, a third reason why a focus on the negative is not sufficient are kids' perceptions. Programs for children that are organized to stamp out bad behaviors that adults don't like are not very likely to attract children. Who would want to attend a program designed to focus on one's faults and squelch all of one's failings? I wouldn't. Kids have to be dragged to a lot of didactic and negative programs. Children and adolescents, like anyone, want to participate in programs that identify their strengths, build on their abilities, and support their development. So it seems to me that if we want to attract children and adolescents to attend in, be engaged in, and focus on programs and stay with them that contribute to their development, we might need to focus on their strengths and our positive vision of who they are and who they might become. A fourth reason is found in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, we need to focus on positive outcomes not only because it is scientifically more balanced and because it can contribute to a more balanced public perception of children, and because a positive vision will be more engaging to children and youth, but because it reflects one of the founding principles of our country. Well, on to question 3. What do we mean by child and family strengths? First, it is worth noting that strengths are not just the absence of bad things. As Karen Pittman famously said, problem-free is not fully prepared. Rather, strengths are the presence of positive characteristics, experiences, behaviors, and relationships. For example, violence. The absence of violence is important. We would like, in an ideal world, to have close to zero violence. But the absence of violence is not enough. We also seek the presence of positive characteristics, such as curiosity, kindness, and positive relationships. Well, to become more concrete, I want to share ongoing work on 3 topics I've been working on: positive child outcomes, healthy marriage, and family strengths. Child outcomes examine outcomes for children as individuals. Healthy marriage outcomes look at dyads, and family strengths focus on triads and groups. First, positive child outcomes, a topic on which I have focused for more than a decade. Multiple child outcome domains are pretty well accepted in the child development field. While labels vary, this set is pretty typical: education and cognitive development, health and safety, and social and emotional development. The third category, social and emotional development, is particularly underdeveloped. Problem behaviors are widely measured, studied, and tracked over time, but there are only a few positive measures in use. But there could be. In the next few slides, I will share some examples of positive and negative items. In the education domain, school dropout is the focus of substantial attention, and appropriately so. But dropout is not all there is to school. In fact, it may be the last thing. School engagement is an important predictor of dropout or school success. And some measures of school engagement that are being tried include: I pay attention in class, I like being at school, and I'm interested in the work at school. Behavior problems represent an important measure of social and emotional development. On the negative side, for example, bullies or is cruel or mean to others, argues too much, is disobedient. On the positive side is social competence. For example, shows respect for teachers and neighbors, gets along well with other children, tries to understand other people's feelings. Well, emotional health is another important aspect of child well-being, and depression is an important aspect of emotional health, as assessed by feeling sad and blue or worthless. But on the positive side, constructs such as gratitude, when I look at the world, I see much to be grateful for, and purpose in life represent additional important constructs that need to be studied. Peers, like families, are assumed to be problematic. For example, we are concerned, and rightly so, about close friends who pressure teens or ask them to drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, or use drugs. But what about friendship, social support, and positive peer pressure? If we don't ask kids how many of their close friends encourage them to do well in school, we will continue to see peers solely as a source of negative influence. And that wouldn't be good science, it wouldn't help the public to perceive children accurately, and it wouldn't send the right message to kids either. Having friends is usually a good thing. Moreover, research indicates that most peer pressure is actually positive. When a child runs away from home, that represents a serious negative behavior. However, an equally important and considerably more common child development measure is a positive parent-child relationship. Believe it or not, most adolescents report they enjoy spending time with their mother or father. Also, most children feel very or mostly close to their parents and feel that they are able to communicate well about most things. Obviously, when children and parents are not close, can't communicate, and don't enjoy one another, that's a problem. And when families break up, children do report feeling less close to their absent parent. In fact, that's a critical reason to measure closeness in communication. The absence of something positive is as important as the presence of something negative. We need to assess which children lack such assets and consider ways to increase the number of children who enjoy positive outcomes. Well, turning then to healthy marriage. When we began our work on healthy marriage more than 2 years ago, one of our first tasks was to develop a conceptual model or framework to clarify some of the assumptions underlying our work. And one assumption is that healthy marriage, like child well-being, has multiple components. It's not a yes-no kind of construct. And the multiple constructs we have identified are shown here, including satisfaction, the most commonly studied element of healthy marriage, communication, interaction or time together, commitment to the couple, intimacy or closeness, conflict resolution, violence, fidelity, or the absence of violence, the presence of fidelity, commitment to children, and marital status and duration. We spent a great deal of time reviewing the research and data on healthy marriage and conducting interviews with people to explore their thoughts about healthy marriage. And again, it turns out that most people are very positive about marriage as an institution, and most people are pretty positive about their own marriages as well, or at least they want to talk about the positive side as well as the negative side. And we're currently working to develop measures for these healthy marriage constructs, items that are positive as well as negative. For example, conflict resolution. Conflict's a negative topic, right? Of course, there are numerous topics of conflict that can create problems for a marriage, such as household chores, managing money, drinking or drugs, other women or men, and raising children. However, every marriage and every relationship, in fact, has conflict. The critical thing is to be able to resolve conflicts constructively, to identify ways to resolve conflict in a healthy marriage. For example, couples might report, "I feel respected, even when we disagree. Even when arguing, we can keep a sense of humor." Humor is a vastly understudied topic. And communication has both positive and negative aspects. Negative items might include, "I have trouble believing anything my partner says to me. My partner is rude when he or she talks to me." But positive items might include, "My partner listens to me when I need someone to talk to. And my partner shows respect for my opinions." Well, if a couple has children, commitment to those children also represents to us an important aspect of a healthy marriage. This construct hasn't been explored before, so we are in the process of developing positive and negative items. For example, a negative item might be, "My partner hasn't been there for the kids." And some positive items might include, "My partner is willing to make personal sacrifices to help take care of our kids. My partner is committed to being there for our kids." Commitment to the couple is what I would describe as the critical missing healthy marriage construct. A few marriage researchers, such as Blaine Fowers, Scott Stanley, and Howard Markman, others, have been developing this construct, which seems surprising because the notion of commitment seems to be bedrock to having a healthy marriage. Thus, while it's important for couples to be satisfied as individuals, to communicate well, to avoid violence and resolve conflicts effectively, they also need to have a commitment to one another that can carry them through the tough times that are virtually inevitable in any relationship. Of course, commitment can be negative. "I feel trapped in this relationship." But it can also be positive. "I believe this relationship can stay strong, even through hard times. I view our relationship as lifelong." Well, family strengths is another area where positive measures, strong theory, and good research are needed. As I mentioned, positive child outcomes are mostly examined at the level of the individual child, while healthy marriage is measured at the level of the dyad or couple. Family strengths are more complicated because the measurement of family strengths goes into relationships and perspectives at the level of the family. And this may mean multiple dyads, triads, or family level measures, and this is truly a challenge. Some propositions posited by family strengths perspective include the notion that families have a reality beyond the individuals and beyond dyads. And family strengths vary across the life cycle and for different cultural groups, and that family strengths help families, and they help the individuals in families deal with stress, challenges, and negative events. There has been remarkably little research on the topic of family strengths, unfortunately, though Robert Hill wrote his book on the strengths of Black families decades ago, and a small cadre of researchers have been working on the topic steadily over the years. Listings of family strengths such as this list have been around for a while, but there has been considerable need for stronger theory and longitudinal studies. Recently, researchers at BYU have proposed a model of family processes that includes 6 family strengths: connecting, providing, protecting, nurturing, including, and regulating. Connection refers to cohesion, warmth, secure attachment, and intimacy. Inclusion considers who's in the family, what are their roles. Regulation asks, how family members influence other members. Teaching and socialization refers to explaining, being a role model, providing feedback to family members. Provisioning, of course, is about providing for the family, and protection means keeping family members safe and healthy. Well, to illustrate one of the constructs, again with both negative and positive items, here are some items that assess including. Some negative items include, I feel distant from my child, or I could raise my kids just as well without my partner. My partner recruits other people to take sides with him or her. But some positive items include, I really feel part of a team with my partner. Family members stand up for each other. Well, I think that researchers have quietly made quite a lot of progress in measuring positive relationships, behaviors, and attitudes over the past several decades. However, there is a need for better theory and conceptual models. At the most basic level, how do these issues fit together? Well, given my work at Child Trends, I became interested in family strengths, healthy marriage, and parent-child relationships because of research linking them with positive child outcomes. But how do they interrelate? Well, their interrelationships are probably quite complex, even more complex than is shown here. And I think that researchers will need to consider positive outcomes for the adults in families, for parents, for example, as well as child outcomes. You know, when I left graduate school for Washington, D.C., theory was the furthest thing from my mind. In fact, to be honest, I found it boring and it seemed irrelevant. I wanted to do research that would inform public policy. After 30 years in Washington, I can attest to the importance of good theory. It is critical to lay out one's assumptions and hypotheses and systematically test them. I leave you with this tentative model not so much to suggest it as to challenge the researchers in the room to consider the hypotheses that they might develop, the measures that they might develop, and the analyses that they might conduct. Because many questions remain. What theoretical or conceptual model is most helpful? How are strengths and positive outcomes fostered? What measures are essential across cultural and economic groups? And how do researchers collect such complex data? And then how should the data be analyzed? Well, in closing, I want to just briefly touch on the next steps that might be taken to increase the focus on positive outcomes in child and family strengths. As I just mentioned, researchers need to build theoretical models and constructs for positive child outcomes, healthy marriage, and strong families. I think that this will require working in interdisciplinary teams that have expertise in multiple methods, both qualitative and quantitative. And we need to develop rigorous measures for basic research, evaluation studies, and trends. It would be valuable to have rigorous and comparable measures for different kinds of research. Basic research could inform intervention work about the factors that are likely to enhance positive development. Evaluation studies could include measures of positive outcomes as dependent variables. And federal agencies could monitor trends in what we want for children, not just the bad outcomes that we don't want, but what we do want. It is also critical to build the research base on whether, how, and for whom positive measures matter. Given the skepticism about positive outcomes and processes, it is urgent that social science research examine the role and value of positive processes and outcomes, and to examine the hypothesis that a positive perspective does add value over and above a focus on the negative outcomes. We also need evaluations and research showing that strengths are malleable. Can we teach gratitude, kindness, and social skills to children? Can we provide marriage education that will increase healthy marriage? Are there family-level interventions that can enhance family strengths? The random assignment studies that I have seen to date are very promising, but the research base is too thin for a skeptical world. And we need strong empirical evidence that evolving conceptual frameworks, evaluations, and measures apply across varied social and economic groups. Much of the research on marriage and families has been conducted with middle-class families and college students. As Hill wrote so many years ago, it is necessary to identify the positive processes and outcomes that support disadvantaged families, and to explore whether processes and outcomes differ across cultural and economic groups. so that we can gradually build a research-based vision of not only what we do not want, but what we do want for children and families. Thank you very much.
Dr. Moore has agreed to take some questions. We've got some microphones that we will have available to let you ask the questions. Please keep your question brief. I'll repeat the question for our television audience. Aaron Baxter and Rachel Eakins, students in the college, have roving microphones to bring to you. Let me pose the first question while you're gathering your thoughts. Dr. Moore, you've talked about this disconnect between public perceptions, which are quite negative, and the reality, as you've shown it in some particular areas. To what extent do those negative public perceptions influence behavior? Say things like a hesitancy to enter into marriage.
This is going to have to be an opinion, but I think that, because we don't really have research on how those perceptions affect behavior too much, but yes, I think a lot of people are very concerned that their marriage won't last, that they don't have what it takes to enter a marriage, and that affects their decision to become married. They're not willing to make an investment in their marriage, and that undermines the capacity to stay married. My guess is that it's quite widespread also, that it really does influence people's willingness to volunteer and to become involved with youth as well.
If we could turn up the house lights just a little bit so I can see hands. Questions from the audience? I can't see any hands in here. I'm sure there's a question. Here, over here on this side. They're bringing you a microphone. While you're getting the microphone, is there a question on this side? All right, would you stand and we'll get you a microphone. If you'd please introduce yourself, give us your name and where you're from.
My name is Becky Johnston. I'm from Kaysville, Utah. And I was wondering if in your opinion, and this is connected to the last question, but if these public perceptions have been affecting the reality of if we perceive all of this negative is happening, if that's what actually we become.
There is one study of marriage that found that couples are investing less in their relationships, and then that does kind of over time result in a less positive relationship. So yeah, a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think that there's a real possibility that that could be happening. And if it were true, that wouldn't be a problem, but unfortunately the data show that people are really underestimating the positive and exaggerating the negative, and so it doesn't seem to be accurate.
Before we go to the next question, is there a question on this side we can get the microphone to? Nope? Okay, over here.
Hi, I'm Sven Wilson from here in Provo. Last year we had Sarah McClanahan come talk about the research from the Fragile Family Study, and one of the most provocative findings from that research is how that there are a lot of young couples that are having children that aren't married, and they feel that they're ready to have children, but that they're not yet prepared to be married. Which is a little bit backwards from some people's perspective. And in a sense, it's that they have such an idealized version of what marriage is, and they don't want it to fail, and they want it to, they want to be ready for it because they know that it's at risk. So I'm wondering how does this balance in with the idea of positive and negative, where in a sense people can have unrealistically high expectations about things like marriage and family. And do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think you do want to have realistic expectations. You want to be down to earth and practical. You don't want to be totally negative, but you don't want to be totally positive either, or then people will not be able to meet their expectations. But also that you'll note that elements of a healthy marriage don't include things like material wealth, and a lot of the things that I think people imagine that they really need in order to establish a healthy marriage. So they need accurate perceptions and expectations, what really makes for a healthy marriage.
We've got a question over here, but before we go to it, is there one over here? There's one towards the back, just around behind you. There you go. And we'll take the question on this side, please.
My name is Sarah Stewart from Salt Lake City. I'm interested to know how much the international community is also addressing these issues, and if you have much correspondence with them, work together with them as well, other international family scholars.
Yeah, actually, it's fascinating that there is a lot of interest in the international community in positive outcomes. I was in South Africa a year or so ago, and as you may know, South Africa is really struggling and has a very high level of AIDS, but they really want to talk about the positives. They want to build on their strengths and not just focus on the negatives. It's, it would be very depressing to do so. People don't want to hear that about their country, about their community, or about their family, or about themselves. They really want to identify their strengths and then build on them. So it's a common theme. The World Bank is working on it. There's quite a lot of work going on internationally.
Question over here. Name and where you're from, please.
My name is Stephen Budge. I'm from Fort Worth, Texas. My question, I didn't notice any comments on discipline in the family, like parents disciplining their children. I was wondering if there was any research being done on that, or what your opinion is on discipline in the family.
There certainly is research being done on that. I think it's highly controversial. I don't think we have it nailed down, but I probably would say that a positive approach to discipline, explaining, justifying, working with kids, building strengths is a good approach to discipline as well. One of the risks of focusing on this, though, is that I don't ever want to be perceived as not recognizing when something's negative. If something is negative, it has to be addressed and dealt with as negative. It's simply that we don't want to stop there. That's not the only thing we want to do.
Is there a question in the back here? Yes. Either of those will be fine. And while we're doing it, is there a question on this side that we can get the microphone to? There's a question up here in the front, please. Yes.
My name is Mackenzie Harrop, and I'm from Mesa, Arizona. I agree with you on focusing on the positive, but what are some ways that we actually can empirically study this? I'm interested in what you're doing right now, and I mean, how we can actually, through surveys, or how can we do this?
Well, I certainly think we need good measures, and I admit, I've spent a decade doing this, in part because it's difficult to get funding and it's difficult to make it happen. The focus really is on the negative, and there's a lot more funding for that. But I think we need studies that have measures of the positive and the negative in the study, and we can compete them. We can see, which matters more. When I look at experimental interventions, it's pretty clear to me that youth development approaches are winning out. There are not enough to persuade a skeptical public, but there really is, that evidence is really building, and it's becoming, I think, fairly clear. Also, early child development programs, which are generally invest in children, and they're generally fairly high quality, are showing that they have pretty positive long-term outcomes. So I think the evidence is building from experimental studies. The basic research studies are where it's lacking.
Thank you, Richard Hinckley. So much of public policy in this field is geared to address the negative. Can you give us an idea or two of how positive outcomes, scientifically based, could affect public policy, and in what ways?
I think people, legislators, and their job is to, monitor the public's purse, and they want to invest money in things that are effective. They need evidence that these intervention strategies are effective, that they are worthwhile. They're pretty convinced that crime and violence and all the negatives are bad. And we do not right now have the evidence that these kinds of more positive approaches are positive, and that we really need the evidence base. This is a real role for research.
Question over here. Either of those will be fine. Just you choose.
My name is Mark Denning. I'm from Paris, Kentucky, and I was wondering, you talked about didactic knowledge not having a positive effect necessarily on concerning sex and drugs. So what would be the positive approach to that? What are the examples of what we could do as opposed to just giving our kids more knowledge about sex and drugs? Okay, and I should emphasize that didactic approaches do
produce knowledge, and I guess knowledge is a good thing. But when somebody lectures, they stand at a podium and shake their fist, and it's usually an adult lecturing to kids to not do something. We just don't find that it changes the behavior, and there's studies in drug education as well as sex education. Better approaches are they involve kids, role-playing, that kind of, so information is still transmitted, but the kids are more involved in learning and in interacting and in practicing it. But in truth, the biggest impact I've ever seen on teen pregnancy rates, or teen childbearing rates actually, is the abecedarian program, which delayed the experimental group compared to the control group about 2 years later when they had their first birth if they were in a multi-year, high-quality early childhood program. So it's interesting that positive early childhood investment had such a huge impact. And I've never seen any kind of sex education program, even an interactional kind of program, have an impact larger than a few months.
You might define didactic. It's come up good.
To define didactic by that, I do mean, lecturing to kids.
Question over here. The microphone to this gentleman. If you'd stand, it's on its way.
I'm Scott Lovelace from here in Provo. When it comes to developing public policy, I certainly applaud your efforts to base policy efforts in empirical work. But there's an awful lot of ideological pressure on the legislatures and Congress and so on. Is there a way to address that and strengthen your hand in this matter?
Well, that's a tough one. I would certainly acknowledge that the role of research in formulating public policy is modest, to be honest. But if you could move something from the 49th percentile to the 51st percentile, you've had an impact. But I think that some things are paradigm shifts in the whole population, and educating the voters is really important. For example, that families are important, and that marriage matters, and that children actually like their parents. Those are general knowledge kinds of issues. But beyond that, I think that one needs to get to members of Congress and legislators, and actually to their staffs. And I would want to say that this isn't just at the national level, but at the state and at the local level. These people are very busy, they're very overworked, and they are reached by people all the time, but rarely by the scientific community. And when the scientific community does reach Congress, they need to reach them very briefly, clearly, succinctly, and in a way that a person who is not a researcher can understand the importance of what it is they're saying.
We have time for one more question. Well, two. There's two hands up here. We'll do both of those. We get the microphone there, and then to this one up here.
I'm Fabi. I'm from Mexico, and I just, like in some areas in Mexico, like people or the culture is not as open-minded than in here. So how could you apply this positive and negative mentality to people that is not like as open-minded in here? And yeah, just that.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, there are certainly people working in Mexico and throughout the world, and I think that people do respond to the message that their community, their family are positive. But I think that the difficult part is responding to the very negative overlay from media and other influences. And in a community where that is not as pervasive, that might actually not be quite as difficult. But I think it's a matter of talking to people about things that they care about, and they recognize that they care about, that the kindness and families, relationships. I think it has some intuitive understanding that people can resonate to.
And then the last question here, the gentleman in the middle, about 4 seats here.
I think one of the reasons that teenagers respond or don't respond actually to exhortations from adults a lot of times is because of their limited perspective. My question is one more of application of what you've studied. If you have teenagers who do have a limited perspective, they're still kind of in those years of everything's a dream and kind of get what they want. How do you help a teenager appreciate the positive, appreciate the importance of a family, appreciate the importance of having good friends, because it looks to them like there's no immediate consequences to their actions? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think part of what we have to do for adolescents, I mean, they're not through even cognitive development, is keep them involved in positive activities. They might be sports, arts, music, develop relationships with mentors and coaches, positive influences, keep them engaged in school and doing positive things, and so that they move through those risky years without making mistakes that are too long-term, and then they can appreciate more cognitively the importance of some of these more abstract arguments.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Don't go away for a minute. As an expression of our appreciation, we present this clock to you, which is engraved Brigham Young University, Marjorie Pay Hinckley Lecturer, 2007, Kristin Anderson Moore. Please join me in another round of applause for Dr. Moore.